A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hello, Herman and Corn. So like many folks, I've become rather obsessed with Claude Code. It is just such a good utility that has taken the latest generation of AI and put it into a utility that feels so antiquated, but yet so familiar to so many people who work with Linux every day. And what I really love about Claude Code and Gemini CLI and Codex is that finally we're seeing the companies themselves wake up to the fact that a repository is just a folder structure and a terminal is just a way of interacting with a computer at a low level without all the bells and whistles of Windows, but that you can do pretty much anything with this combination. And I think that it's a big mistake that we've thought so far about these purely as developer tools or coding tools. I've been arguing for a while that they're totally fantastic for systems administration, which doesn't involve creating software, but involves just administering a computer system. And I've used them like this to administer Linux servers, Docker networks, Linux desktops, you name it. They can do anything. But the beauty of the system, in a sense, is the fact that it's terminal centric. And having used Linux for 20 years, I've always had a love-hate relationship with command line interfaces or TUIs. Sometimes remembering all the parameters gets really tedious, and you feel like there's no need to use them if there's a easier alternative. But their upside is that they're naturally distraction free, and you just learn how to make the most out of them by using them every day. You learn the little slash commands, and Claude Code is the first terminal program or CLI that I've truly loved. And even if you gave me a Claude Code interface that was created as a GUI, the only reason I'd want to use it at the moment is if it took away the fact that it's bound to a local machine, which is a limit of running local repositories. But there's an area in user interface that I feel like really gets overlooked, and that's exactly this. It's UI for a type of user that prefers a very low visual clutter experience. We've all heard of or read the book Don't Move My Cheese. Is that what it's called, Han? Don't Move My Cheese. Han is nodding. And I often feel like a Don't Move My Cheeser whenever you log into Gmail and you see that someone at Google has decided to change or mess with a perfectly functional UI UX. And often it's in the direction of complication. It's often well intended, like Google is trying to put their AI features everywhere now, but it creates a very overwhelming UI experience. I think what often gets overlooked, I think that UI UX is a hugely overlooked subject, and I think that as the actual hard work of generating code becomes increasingly done by machines and increasingly therefore easier to do it at pace, that maybe we can finally start thinking about UI UX much more deeply and give it the attention it deserves. And one of those areas I feel is UI for that works for different types of people, because one type of brain might want to have literally every control at their fingertips and they don't really see a cluttered UI as cluttered. Another person might find that hiding absolutely everything is oversimplification and they still want to have those controls. A third user, this is probably me, wants to have a bit of power and a lot of power under the hood and have that kind of middle ground. So I'm wondering, Herman and Corn, about what research has been done into not just best practices in UI, because when we think about stuff like accessibility guidelines that should be universalized, we often make sweeping statements like, this is good UI, this is bad UI. And I feel like there's a lot of nuance missing in terms of what type of UI UX works for different users with different brains who process information differently, and how we can design UI UX that is maybe better for that population, Or maybe we can even begin to see more UI UX that is really customizable by the user. So they have the ability to change settings for their tools like Gmail without needing to necessarily change it setting by setting, but create profiles maybe that work for different groups of people. I think it's a potentially really interesting area. I'd love to know what thought has been done about this to date in the UI UX world, and what do you think of how some of these ideas could actually be brought to life in the web design era of tomorrow?
Welcome back to my weird prompts, everyone. I am Corn Poppleberry, and I have to say, I am feeling a little overwhelmed today. Not because of work or life here in Jerusalem, but because I opened my email this morning and it felt like sitting in the cockpit of a fighter jet. There were buttons everywhere, 3 different sidebars, and a pop-up telling me about a feature I've already used 10 times. It made me realize that our digital world is getting very, very crowded.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn. I know exactly what you mean. It is the classic struggle of the modern interface. Our housemate Daniel actually sent us a fascinating prompt about this very thing. He has been diving deep into Claude Code and other command line interface tools lately, and it got him thinking about why those stripped-back, text-heavy environments feel so much better for some people while being a complete nightmare for others.
It is funny, because Daniel is always tinkering with his setup in the other room. He is looking for that perfect balance. His question really hits on the heart of cognitive diversity. He is wondering what research actually says about user interface and user experience best practices for people with different cognitive needs. Specifically, why do some of us crave zero visual clutter while others want every single control visible at all times? And more importantly, can we move toward a world where our software actually adapts to our brains, instead of forcing our brains to adapt to the software?
It is a massive question, Corn. And it is one that the design world is finally being forced to take seriously, especially with the European Accessibility Act having come into full effect last year in June of 2025. We usually talk about accessibility in terms of physical limitations, like screen readers for the blind. But cognitive accessibility, the way our brains process information and manage attention, is the new frontier.
Right, and before we get into the weeds, I want to reference something we talked about way back in episode 550. We were debunking the myth of learning styles, you know? The idea that some people are strictly visual learners while others are strictly auditory. While the rigid categories of learning styles might be a myth, the reality of cognitive load and preference is very real. People do have different thresholds for how much information they can juggle at once.
And that brings us to the core concept here, which is cognitive load theory. This was developed by John Sweller in the late 1980s. The basic idea is that our working memory has a limited capacity. If you flood that memory with too much irrelevant information, what we call extraneous cognitive load, the brain cannot process the actual task at hand, which is the intrinsic load.
So, when I open that email app and see 4 different menus and a flashing notification, that is all extraneous load. My brain is burning energy just trying to ignore the clutter before I even read a single sentence of the email.
Precisely. Now, for some people, that clutter is just a minor annoyance. Their brains are very good at filtering out the noise. But for others, especially those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or certain types of neurodivergence, that filtering mechanism is much less efficient. For them, a cluttered user interface is not just ugly, it is actually a functional barrier. It makes the software unusable because the cognitive cost of navigating the interface is higher than the benefit of the tool itself.
This explains why Daniel is so obsessed with the command line right now. If you are using something like Claude Code, which has really taken off this year, the interface is literally just a blinking cursor and the text you type. There is no sidebar. There are no icons. It is the ultimate low-clutter environment.
It is, but here's the flip side, Corn. And this is where the nuance Daniel mentioned comes in. While the command line is low clutter, it has a massive memory load. You have to remember the commands. You have to remember the syntax. In design, we call this recognition versus recall. A graphical user interface allows you to recognize a button. You see the trash can icon and you know it deletes things. In a command line, you have to recall the specific string of characters to delete a file.
So it is a trade-off. You are trading visual clutter for mental storage.
And research shows that different populations have very different preferences for this trade-off. For example, some studies on users with autism suggest a preference for highly structured, predictable, and even dense information environments. They might actually want all the controls visible because it provides a complete map of what the software can do. They do not want things hidden behind hamburger menus or smart disappearing sidebars because that creates uncertainty and anxiety.
That is fascinating. So, the minimalist trend in modern design, where everything is hidden behind white space and clean lines, might actually be making software harder to use for people who need that structural certainty.
Very much so. We have moved toward this aesthetic of simplicity, but simplicity is subjective. To a power user, simplicity is having every tool on the workbench within arm's reach. To a novice, simplicity is having only one button on the screen. When we force everyone into the same clean interface, we are often just moving the complexity somewhere else, usually into a hidden layer that requires more clicks and more mental mapping to find.
It reminds me of our discussion in episode 859 about keyboard layouts. We talked about how the QWERTY layout is objectively inefficient, but we stick with it because the cost of switching is so high. Design is often about these path-dependent choices, but Daniel's point about customizable user interface profiles suggests we do not have to be stuck in one path anymore.
Right, and that is the dream, isn't it? Imagine if when you first set up a new operating system or a complex app like Photoshop, it did not just ask for your name and email. Imagine if it gave you a cognitive profile assessment. Not a test, but a few choices. Do you prefer to see all options at once, or do you prefer a guided, step-by-step process? Do you find high-density datasets helpful or overwhelming?
I can hear the pushback from developers already, Herman. They are going to say, Herman, it is hard enough to build one interface that works. Now you want us to build 5. How do we actually implement this without making the development process an absolute nightmare?
Well, that is where the current state of technology in 2026 gets really exciting. In the past, creating multiple interfaces meant manually hard coding every single version. But with modern design systems and component-based architecture, we are moving into the era of generative user interfaces. This is something we touched on in episode 835 regarding red teaming user experiences. If you have a robust set of components and a clear set of rules, an artificial intelligence can actually assemble the interface on the fly based on a user's profile.
So, instead of a static layout, the software is more like a liquid that takes the shape of the container, where the container is the user's cognitive preference.
That is a great analogy, and we are seeing the beginnings of this with things like Apple Intelligence and Google's latest adaptive layouts. Think about dark mode. 10 years ago, dark mode was a niche feature for hackers. Now, it is a universal standard. Why? Because we realize that for many people, high brightness is a physical and cognitive strain. We are also seeing focus modes in operating systems that silence notifications and hide desktop icons. These are essentially user interface profiles for specific cognitive states.
But Daniel is asking for something deeper. He is talking about all controls visible versus low visual clutter. This goes beyond just a color theme or silencing pings. This is about the actual hierarchy of information.
It is. And research into layered interfaces is the key here. Ben Schneiderman, a pioneer in human-computer interaction, proposed this idea of multi-layer interfaces. The first layer is basic, for the novice or the person who needs low clutter. As the user becomes more comfortable, or if their cognitive style demands it, they can unlock layers that add more complexity and more direct controls.
I like that, but I worry about the don't move my cheese problem Daniel mentioned. Every time a major company changes a button by 3 pixels, the internet goes into a meltdown. If the interface is constantly shifting, or if I have a profile that is different from yours, does that make it harder for us to help each other? If I am trying to walk you through a problem over the phone and my screen looks totally different from yours, we are in trouble.
That is a very valid conservative critique of this idea. Consistency is a form of cognitive accessibility in itself. If I know that the print button is always in the top right, I do not have to think. If we move toward hyper-customization, we risk destroying the shared language of software. This is why many designers are hesitant. They believe that a good design should be intuitive for everyone. But the hard truth is that everyone is a myth. A design that is intuitive for a neurotypical person might be a brick wall for someone with dyslexia or dyscalculia.
So, how do we balance that? How do we give people the freedom to customize their experience without breaking the universal utility of the tool?
I think the answer lies in standardized profiles. Instead of every single person having a unique snowflake interface, we could have 4 or 5 well-researched archetypes. You have the minimalist profile, the power user profile, the high structure profile, and the guided profile. These would be standardized across different apps. If you choose the minimalist profile in your operating system, your email, your browser, and your word processor all inherit those same basic rules.
That makes a lot of sense. It is like the information radiators we discussed in episode 649. You want the information to be available at a glance in a way that suits the environment. If my environment is a brain that gets easily distracted, my information radiator needs to be very focused.
And let's look at the research on information density. There is a famous study from the University of Washington that looked at how people with different cognitive styles interacted with web layouts. They found that users who scored high on need for cognition, people who actually enjoy effortful thinking, preferred dense, complex layouts with lots of text and links. They felt more in control. Meanwhile, users with lower need for cognition scores or higher anxiety levels felt overwhelmed and performed better with sparse, image-heavy layouts.
This really reframes the whole good versus bad debate. We often look at a site like Craigslist and say, wow, this looks like it was made in 1995. It is terrible design. But for a certain type of user, Craigslist is actually perfect. It is high density, no frills, and every category is visible on the homepage. There are no hidden menus. It is incredibly efficient if your brain works that way.
Craigslist is a great example of a high structure, all controls visible interface. On the other hand, you have something like the modern Apple homepage, which is basically one giant image and 3 words. That is the low clutter extreme. Both are good design, but they serve different cognitive goals. This ties into Iris Vessi's cognitive fit theory from the early 90s, which suggests that performance improves when the information presentation matches the task and the user's mental model.
So, what can we actually do now? If I am a developer or a designer listening to this in 2026, how do I start implementing this without waiting for some futuristic AI to do it for me?
The first step is user empowerment. Give users the ability to toggle major interface elements. This is not just about moving buttons, it is about functional grouping. Allow a user to hide the sidebar and keep it hidden. Allow them to choose between icon only, text only, or icon and text for menus. Research shows that for many people with cognitive disabilities, icons alone are confusing, while for others, text-heavy menus are a nightmare. Giving that choice is a huge win for accessibility.
It is also about the default settings. We know that most people never change their defaults. So, the most important research for designers is determining what the safest default is, while making the escape hatch to a different profile very obvious.
Right. And we need to move away from the idea that clean is always better. We need to design for cognitive fit. If I am doing a complex data analysis, I do not want a clean interface. I want a dashboard that looks like a NASA control room because that fits the complexity of my task.
I think about this in terms of our house, actually. Daniel's room is very different from mine. He likes everything tucked away in drawers. I like having my books and my tools out where I can see them because if I don't see them, they don't exist to me. That is object permanence, which is another cognitive factor. If an interface hides a feature, for some users, that feature has ceased to exist.
That is a brilliant point, Korn. Out of sight, out of mind is a very literal reality for many people, especially those on the ADHD spectrum. This is why the minimalist trend can be so damaging. It assumes that everyone has perfect mental mapping of where everything is hidden.
Let's talk about the future for a second. Daniel mentioned customizable profiles. If we are heading toward a world where AI agents are doing more of the heavy lifting, does the interface even matter as much? In episode 8 on 35, we talked about using agents as model users. Could we use those same agents to actually build the interface for us in real time?
I think that is exactly where we are going. We're moving from user interface to intent interface. Instead of me navigating a series of menus to find the export to PDF function, I just express the intent. The software then presents me with exactly the controls I need for that task, formatted in the way my profile prefers. If I am a visual person, it might show me a preview. If I am a command line person like Daniel, it might just give me a text confirmation.
It sounds like the ultimate form of individual liberty in the digital space. Instead of being forced into the standardized experience dictated by a big tech company, I get an experience that is tailored to my own mind. That feels very aligned with our view of personal agency.
It really is. It is about moving the power from the designer to the user. For too long, designers have acted like paternalistic architects, deciding how we should move through digital space for our own good. But cognitive diversity means that what is good for the architect might be confusing for the resident.
I want to pivot slightly to the command line obsession Daniel has. Why is it that something so old feels so new right now? Claude, code in these Gemini command line tools are becoming huge. Is it just a trend, or is there a deeper cognitive reason why power users are running back to the terminal?
I think it is a reaction to interface fatigue. We have reached a point where graphical interfaces are so bloated with tracking, ads, and engagement features that the terminal feels like a sanctuary. It is a high-signal, low-noise environment. For a developer who is already juggling complex logic in their head, the last thing they need is a graphical interface that is trying to sell them a subscription or show them a "What's New" pop-up.
So, it is a way of reclaiming their cognitive bandwidth.
When you are in the terminal, you are in a flow state machine. There are no distractions. And because tools like Claude Code are now integrating natural language, that recall problem I mentioned earlier, having to remember exact commands, is being solved. You can just type "find the bug" in the login script and it does it. You get the low clutter of the command line with the recognition ease of natural language. It is the best of both worlds.
That is a major shift. If natural language replaces the need to memorize /commands or obscure syntax, then the command line becomes accessible to a much broader population. It is no longer just for the nerds like you, Herman.
Hey, I take pride in that title. But you are right, it democratizes the high-efficiency environment.
Let's talk about the practical takeaways for our listeners. If someone is feeling that cockpit overwhelm I mentioned at the start, what can they actually do?
First, audit your tools. Many modern apps have hidden settings for density. For example, Gmail has a density setting, compact, comfortable, or default. Most people never touch it. If you feel overwhelmed, try comfortable. If you feel like you are wasting time scrolling, try compact.
Second, look for distraction-free modes. Whether it is in your word processor or your browser, there are almost always ways to strip back the interface. If an app doesn't offer it, look for a browser extension that does. There are reader mode extensions that can turn any cluttered website into a clean, text-focused experience.
And third, don't be afraid to try the Daniel method. Try out some of these new AI-powered command line tools. Even if you aren't a coder, tools like Perplexity or the Gemini side panel are moving toward a more text-first interaction model. See how it feels to interact with information without the chrome of a traditional website.
I think there is also a lesson here for how we treat each other. If I show you my screen and you think it looks like a mess, or if I look at yours and think it's barren and confusing, we have to realize that it's not because one of us is wrong. It is because our brains are literally processing that information differently. It is a form of diversity we don't talk about enough.
That is so true, Korn. We talk a lot about user experience, but we rarely talk about human experience. The human experience is vast and varied. Our tools should reflect that.
I think we have covered a lot of ground here. From cognitive load theory and Sweller's research to the potential for generative user interfaces and the return of the command line. It is a big shift coming, and I think Daniel is right to be thinking about it now.
Definitely. And if you are interested in how this all evolved, I highly recommend checking out episode 816, where we talked about the evolution of human order from scrolls to SQL. It gives a great historical context for why we are so obsessed with organizing information in the first place.
And if you are on the design side of things, go back to episode 835 on red teaming your user experience. It is a great companion to this discussion because it talks about how to actually test these interfaces for edge cases and diverse users.
Well, I think that just about wraps up our look at cognitive diversity in user interfaces. It is a fascinating field, and I suspect we will be seeing those customizable profiles sooner than we think.
I hope so. I am ready for my corn-sized interface that doesn't look like a fighter jet.
We will get you there, brother.
Before we go, a quick reminder to our listeners. If you have been enjoying my weird prompts, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app or over on Spotify. It really does help other people find the show, and we love hearing your feedback.
It genuinely makes a difference. You can also find our full archive of over 900 episodes at our website, myweirdprompts.com. There is a contact form there if you want to send in a prompt like Daniel did, or you can just browse the RSS feed.
Thanks for joining us in Jerusalem today. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, stay curious and keep tweaking those settings.
Bye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.